Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Finding Me in the ITV networks. Certainly we're in an age where the media, especially the news media, is in very much of a disrepute. If one considers the illegal invasion of Iraq, the embedded journalists, and of course the role of the media in perpetuating the lies and the cycle of violence against innocent people, the question therefore today raises without a doubt is that can the media be trusted? And so it is breathtakingly refreshing when one comes across a media organization that calls itself Media for Justice. So what is it? Is the media a voice for the voiceless, or is the media a voice of the corporations and those who have power? With me today I have the executive directors of Media for Justice, which is Sipho, Singiswa and Gillian Schutte. I'd like to say thank you very much for being here and welcome to the studios.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Gillian, I'd like to start with you. Why Media for Justice? Because the media is supposed to be a voice for the voiceless. Now, why are we adding this particular description to say our media is for justice?
We started out as human rights documentary filmmakers, and each community we went into would ask us to help them get some media coverage, mainstream media coverage. And we realized that that really wasn't happening. That communities, that mainstream media is not interested in specific stories, and particularly if it calls for corporate accountability and government accountability, but mainly corporate accountability. So those stories were being missed out, those voices were not being heard, and that famous saying, there's nobody who's voiceless, there's just people that are intentionally ignored. So we realized that there was an absolute huge gap in the market, not just to be in film festival arenas, to a very specific audience, but to try and get those voices into the mainstream audience and to call for accountability, corporate accountability, government accountability within the public arena. And so that's why we started Media for Justice, because it's very important that those voices are heard and that stories are told from a community perspective, from their own voices and not being spoken for. And that's what the platform's all about.
And Sipho, I see that your focus is a lot on social justice as well.
Yes.
So do you feel that this was necessary to complement the whole idea of Media for Justice?
Well, the whole... For example, when you started, you mentioned Iraq, for example, and embedded journalism and so on, and asked, can media be trusted? I think the question should be, can mainstream media be trusted? Because if I make an example with South Africa, there's a tendency in South Africa with social issues, like the service delivery problem and the protest and so on, where we've seen the mainstream media only focusing when people start burning tires on the road and going amok and so on, but without ever taking the time to find out what processes have people followed before they resorted to taking out to the streets and burning the tires and so on, So when you look at that, then you realize that, the poor often don't have access or a platform, to express their issues, so that the whole community, the society of South Africans in this instance, can actually understand what the issues are all about, So yes, we decided, that it is absolutely necessary to have Media for Justice, for example, a platform that can really help us understand what are the problems that people are dealing with on a daily basis, what are the human rights issues that affect even children.
And I think as you're speaking, it brings to my mind this vision that the media is falsely or intensely perpetuating an idea or a vision that black people are aggressive, that they're violent, that they only know how to express their voices through violence. Because like you said, the processes are not covered. The failings, the hardships, I suppose the heartbreak also, and the challenges that the poor have in reaching out to authority and reaching out to power are never ever problematized or never ever adequately expressed. So Media for Justice tries to bring forth the entire process, a holistic approach to the way in which particular social issues are dealt with or how people respond to them.
Yes, one of our little catchphrases is reality beyond the soundbite, because that mainstream media has little sound bites, and it's usually in a very trying situation. A protest is happening, the journalists are nervous. So as you say, the process, the story, the narrative, the humanity, all of that is missed out on to a large extent. And that's absolutely necessary, that side of the story is heard, and that whole irrational. It's true. People in mainstream media see what they perceive as an irrational act of violence. And it really is not that. Even what is perceived as violence, even those protests are often not violent protests. They often, there's anger there, but it's controlled. And the citizens are being really quite well behaved. And in our experiences being out there with our cameras, often the aggression will come from a bullet coming from the police force, for instance, that will suddenly set people off. I'm not saying that there never is an outbreak of absolute an eruption of anger, but often what we see on the mainstream media is only anger, only eruptions of violence. And in fact, for instance, Marikana. Again, we were in the field there with our cameras, and it was incredibly well controlled. It was a leaderless, we were talking 2 years ago, a leaderless strike. And it was incredibly controlled, and people were incredibly well behaved and restrained. But the way we saw it on media, there's pictures of the close-up of that man licking the panga, the spear.
And people rushing
looked
with
irrational. But if you were there in the midst of that, you were not in danger. It was incredibly disciplined behavior.
And I think I have to perhaps say that we see this discipline reinforcing itself now from the latest discussions or basically descriptions that have been put forward through from the food parcels that are being handed out in Marikana. You see the same discipline, the same dignity amongst the people. Exactly. We have to go to a break, and then before we go to a break, I just want to read this quote by Malcolm X, and when we come back, perhaps we can talk a little bit more about it, where he says, "If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing." So we'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the second segment of Finding Me Today with Gillian, Schutte and Sipho Singiswa. And before we went to the break, we were speaking about the dignity of ordinary South Africans, which is often sort of excused or not portrayed in the media intentionally in order to give forward a different kind of a story. And I quoted Malcolm X, where he said that the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. And Sipho, I think you would like to add something to that.
Yes, that's actually so true and so profound. I'll make an example with South Africa, for example. Pre-1994, you are aware of our history. We were fighting for equal rights for all, equality, human rights, social justice, and so on, As black people immediately in South Africa under those conditions, you mentioned the inequalities that were so stark. You were immediately, even by the press, termed a terrorist, a communist, and all of that, and people wholesalely believe this, the white population, for example. Consequently, black South Africans' human dignity and rights were constantly violated without a pipsqueak from the white community. And at the end of the day, they said, we didn't know. It wasn't in the news or on TV and so on, But these were families that had domestic workers, gardeners working from them, coming from these communities that were being brutalized. We had groups in the townships and so on. But the mainstream media wasn't reporting on these issues. We had at some stage to actually smuggle in, foreign journalists and so on as part of, I don't know whether we did this very consciously, but some of us did. I was too young to really understand that. But, also to preserve that part of the history that the mainstream media wasn't covering. And unfortunately, we're seeing an almost similar trend today, talking international mainstream media, where, for example, since you mentioned Iraq, we see what's happening with the so-called Arab Spring, yes. Libya, Syria, and so on, Africa, the media spoke for a very long time about weapons of mass destruction. For a long time, we heard about terrorism in Palestine, when the bombs were going and so on, but we were not given, unless you made a point of digging out, we were not allowed the space to understand that there were people in places like West Bank, Gaza, and so on, who were experiencing similar conditions that we see in places like Marikana today and so on. And all people can hope for is, the truth. So that out of the midst of all this reality, they can also decide what are the right decisions to make that will impact on them and their kids in future, for that matter. Now, when you deny people that opportunity, because media is supposed to also inform people, I don't want to say educate, because that's a dicey term.
Yes. Because, of course, educating how? Because education also has an agenda.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, no, media is supposed to inform people, and I suppose today the best platform, therefore, is social media, right? Gillian, I want to come quickly to this before we wrap the second segment, is your journey into your own identity. Now, because obviously I can see that, reaching out to society, giving a voice to the voiceless, championing the voice of the voiceless, raising issues of social justice, all of these things are important to you, but it's also very contradictory to your own heritage, your own journey, I suppose, into your own identity, and you being a white South African. So your journey into your own identity began when your son started asking questions. And I'd like you to explain to me quickly, because he's such a cute little fellow. I mean, I watched the video. The way his mind works, and you've named him Kai. So what does Kai mean? And what was this astounding discovery for you when you started inquiring about your own genealogical heritage?
Well, I'll start off with his name. Kai actually has a meaning in so many different languages, so it's a very universal name. However, in a South African indigenous language, it means the great one, okay. Or God, or life. It's got that meaning to it. And I always say he chose his name because it just popped into my head one night. And I woke Sipho up and said, Kai, and he said immediately, that's it, Yeah. So in terms of, my identity had started, I would say, when I'd left, because my mother married a Rhodesian farmer.
Okay.
And so we were in that horrible propaganda war. Then we came back to South Africa. And then I went to university and I studied African politics. I majored in that. Okay. And I studied the Rhodesian War. So I was really able to unpack a lot of the propaganda at that stage, but still very young and still not really grappling with the deeper issues of what race and the whiteness construct means, etc. And then when Kai was born, and it's incredible because through him I've also got to realize how much influence comes from a family, okay. How much we were influenced by our family, and you forget about it when you're older, but when I see how he interpreted our conversations, obviously we have a lot of political conversations within our household around our work, etc., and our circle of friends and that, and Kai would reinterpret these in his own little, child mind. And so he started at a very young. The first thing he wanted to know was, Daddy, who painted your face brown?
Are you serious?
Yeah, that was the first question he asked us about colour. because he went to nursery school very young, and they started to do colour, and for some reason my face was normal and Daddy's face was painted brown.
Okay.
And at that stage he was still very much in my ambit, mummy's ambits. And then he asked me why we painted him yellow.
Okay.
One day in the bath, he's like, "You white and Daddy's black." And I said, "Yeah, but we both made you." And he said, "Yeah, but you painted me yellow or golden, So he started to really question, what colour is God? Is God white, gold, or,
Did he question about God at that point?
Is God white, black, or golden?
Okay.
And so, one has to find answers for these questions.
I'm sure. It must have been challenging.
Yeah, it was quite challenging. And also just to... people would say at nursery school, "That's not your mummy. She's white." And, just to keep this child, to let them discover and ask those questions and talk about colour, and not pretend that colour doesn't exist, because clearly it does.
Yes.
But then to put it in a way that doesn't affect his self-esteem, etc., etc. Doesn't put too much of a burden on him. But yes, definitely through his questions, I had to find those answers, and that's where I did start to grapple with my own whiteness, in fact.
Okay, so before we talk about your own whiteness, we have to go to a break. But when we come back, then you can perhaps carry this for us. So we'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah, and welcome to the final segment of part 1 of this particular interview with Gillian and Sipho. And before we went into the break, Gillian, you were explaining about this whole search for identity, which started with Kai, but then you had to deal with your own whiteness, and I'd like you to explain that a little bit further for us.
Well, the way Kai interpreted Sipho is he's very interested in history, and I have an aunt who's very interested in history, and that's how we got to know that our clans, lived in the same area in the 1700s, and they were actually at war with each other.
Wow.
Sipho's was a clan and my Dutch ancestors. And when we started to speak about this, and at the beginning of that film, that was a totally natural conversation. We were getting ready, the film of the segment you're going to show, Chasing the Ancestors. We were getting ready to go, and I said to Kai, "Do you know where we're going?" And then, he said, "Yes, we're going to Cape and the ancestors." And then he says, "Your ancestors were the baddies."
Yes.
And that's when you realize, wow, if he's picking up what we're saying and creating his own little narrative around that, and clearly it was cowboys and, all sorts of things in his mind, imagine how much the indoctrination of our own narratives that we grew up with, how embedded those are into our DNA almost, or into at least our unconscious, and then how over 300 years, it does become almost like an imprint into your DNA.
It almost becomes a truth to you.
Yes.
Yes.
And so it really struck me that, in order to deal with, it can't be a shallow process. It has to be, you have to deal with racism on your own personal racism on 3 different levels at least. Your own first of all, your conscious racism, and then your unconscious racism, which is the difficult one, because how would you know what that is really?
Yes.
Except by how people respond to you around yourself, how those messages are coming through. And then, of course, as I say, the 300-year, 500-year memory that whiteness carries within its own collective. And how does that impact on our behavior and our thinking?
But while you're saying that, Gillian, isn't it difficult for people to actually even access that kind of information, or maybe there's a reluctance to access that kind of information because it means admitting a certain amount of guilt? Don't you think so, Sipho?
Most definitely. I made an example earlier on how, coming back to the history of this country, and it's said that, you're seeing similar traits continuing in this country, where, we one society, or we're supposed to be one society, but we are so disconnected, just talking about where we were with Gift of Givers yesterday, in this country we have what is called the Children's Rights Charter and so on.
Yes.
And people, because also the media, the mainstream media, doesn't actually bother to inform people so that they can make well-informed decisions, Now, when the people are hungry, in Marikana, places like that, you know, it's not only the adults that we are dealing with. We are dealing with babies, with children, and so on, who cannot look after themselves. Now, we have a very well-praised constitution in this country. Now, everyone is raving about it, you know, but poor people can't access this brilliant constitution because also, you know, they are not being properly informed by the media, you know, so that they can claim their socio-economic rights and stuff like that. So again, you know, if you look at what sometimes I term, you know, the propaganda of the wealthy, you know, the capitalists, the mind bosses, you know, it is absolutely incredible that in South Africa we are still living so far apart, and the media hasn't actually helped us, the mainstream media. I'm not making a blanket statement, you know. There is media, particularly community media and so on, but even that community media is fast being owned by the very same people, the corporate world, you know, because information is a very strong tool to change the thinking in any society, positive or, like you earlier on you said, you know, sometimes people are fed propaganda that it becomes for the recipients the truth for them, you know. They hate people who are oppressed, people the vulnerable, that, you know, those who are strong and have the means should be helping, because, you know, again, the information is so corrupted, if I can go that radical, you know. Okay, but so considering that of course it means introspecting. It means you have to go beyond what the mainstream media is offering, that you have to ask questions. And obviously, I know you have a very inquiring mind. I mean, that's what led you perhaps to African politics, etc., and to start all of this. The challenge then, I find, Gillian, and I think many of my students also, is to deal with the guilt of this heritage, of this past. Something that you had to probably encounter, but also to admit that you're still benefiting from privilege. And without a doubt, many white people still find it very difficult to articulate it. So how did you get to that point?
Well, it's an ongoing process. I don't say I've got to that point.
Okay.
You know, how do we know we've got to that point?
Yes.
But so it's a lifelong commitment, really. But we are actively taught in our structure of whiteness, our construct of whiteness, not to reflect on what it means to be white. So I say that in terms of what Sipho was saying, it's the silences in which you find the racism, not what people are saying, not this Rainbow Nation discourse. It's what people choose to get outraged by and what they choose not to, what they choose to ignore. Those are the spaces I'm interested in excavating, because those are the spaces within ourselves that we, we need to explore. And the guilt thing. I mean, first of all, guilt. It's not very fashionable to buy into white guilt, and even if you go through a process of deconstruction, people will label it guilt, and it becomes like a pathology of sorts. You know, I say yes, we do have to go through. We do have to grapple with the guilt of the. And it's not just ancestral guilt. It's not the fact that our ancestors were genocidal, etc., etc. It's the guilt of knowing that every single privilege you have has been built on the backs of people that were oppressed by your people. You are complicit in that. It's an acknowledgement of that, at least, and what you do with that information. You can't simply acknowledge it, because that doesn't help. That doesn't move you. Yes. But it's the first step to, it's like alcoholism. It's the first step to.
The first step is to acknowledge. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, well, it's a complex topic, the guilt. But guilt is very counterproductive. Okay. So turn that guilt into activism. That's my motto.
Okay. Yeah. Wait, but we're at the end of this particular segment, and then Sipho, I'm going to give you a chance to respond when you come back to part two. But I want to conclude with this, perhaps just so that you can reflect on it, and when we come back, is to think about that maybe by acknowledging it, by turning it into activism, it's the first step towards social justice. So perhaps that's how maybe we can start the entire process to actual transformation and to the actual attempt to try and reach social justice. But we're at the end of this particular segment of the first interview with Sipho and Gillian. As you can see, we have much to talk about. So we're going to come back next week with part 2. But till then, fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.